It's Thursday, 11 o'clock. It's time for this week's watch drop. That was a low one. Yeah. For this week's drop, well, there really isn't a theme if I'm totally honest, but there are a few sort of left field choices that I'm going to run through today. We've got some really interesting dress watches, one that I'm particularly excited about. And we've also got a couple of Rolexes where the condition is just so good, I have to shout them out. I'm going to start with the Ralph Lauren Ultra Slim Classique. This may look and sound like a fashion watch, but actually, the depths at which they've gone to make this the perfect dress watch really go beyond many watchmakers. I suppose you could call Ralph Lauren a watchmaker, but what they've done is that they've chosen to focus on the design of the watch and the way in which it's created and partnered with Piaget in order to make that a proper watch. I mean, there's no two ways about it. This is not a fashion watch. Firstly, the caliber inside is the Piaget 430, and that's a caliber that's used in ultra-thin watchmaking, and notably it's in the Piaget Altiplano. So that's the line of watches that are known for being ultra-thin. One of the Altiplanos is probably, there's a race for the thinnest watch, and for about a week I think that watch was the thinnest watch ever made. But Piaget have got chops in this game. They have focused for decades on trying to make the thinnest calibers in order to be able to put thick chunks of stone on their dress watches. So these guys have been around and they know exactly what they're doing when it comes to ultra-thin dress watches. Now, Ralph Lauren have also gone out and procured a 19th century rose lathe, and that is entirely to produce this aesthetic with a guilloche pattern on the outside of the bezel, but also in the center of the dial. When this watch catches the light, you just get to see this incredible vintage aesthetic that makes the watch sing. I'm so excited to see it in the metal. I've wanted to find one of these watches for such a long time, and really it doesn't disappoint at all. It's really something that you would expect to see in something very, very high end. And I'm just so pleased that we've managed to get one in. I'm talking about this and I'm sort of basically convincing myself that I need to buy it. So, maybe I will. I adore this thing. I really do. And whoever takes it home is going to enjoy that, I'm sure. Brilliant, brilliant thing. Moving on to another somewhat left field choice. This is a Habring by Massena Lab. So it's an Irwin Lab 01. The case is bronze, and I know that Habring don't use that material very often at all, really, but it complements the black dial really, really well. Now, why is it left field? Well, I think the reason I think it's so curious is that on a somewhat value watch, they've really gone to town on the movement. This is a jump seconds complication. And I've always found the jump seconds complication quite funny because it looks to most people like it's a quartz watch. The seconds hand doesn't sweep in the same way that you see in typically high-end watchmaking. But actually, it's an elevation above what you'd see in a sweeping seconds because they've put in that effort to hold the running seconds to the point that it needs to tick forward to the next one. I'm not explaining this very well, but suffice to say, it's harder to produce a jump seconds than it is to have a sweeping seconds hand. And I love that because it looks like a cheaper watch. It looks like a quartz and it's not. And I think that's really charming. I think it's a really interesting watch to own. I love the subtle tick-tock to it. And I think that the patination that's happening on the bronze case is really charming. It complements the dial so well. Really, really lovely watch. And yeah, I think as an addition of 50, you're not going to see many of them around. It's a great thing. Really like it. moving forward to what is becoming known as a bit of a neo-vintage darling. This is the Audemars Piguet Starwheel from the 90s. We've had a few of these in. We're very lucky to have had a few of them in because it really is a fantastic watch. A really curious way of telling the time. I know that sounds obvious, but when you wear one of these watches for a certain amount of time, you become used to seeing the day in hour blocks and watching that hour sort of waste away, or trying to make the most of each hour, I suppose. That's more of a positive way of putting it. The sapphire discs are not visible, particularly until they're on that hour white section. But while they're out of the way, you get to enjoy the hand-engraved finishing to the rest of the dial. The AP Starwheel came in lots of different forms, lots of different metals. This is a rose gold example. You don't see many of these. Lots of them are yellow gold. They also came with a guilloche finish to them, in the same way that we saw on the Ralph Lauren Classique. But this one has that extra level of rarity to it, where some very skilled craftsman has gone around and created this sort of floral pattern to, I'd say, 2/3 of the dial. And so although the time telling is just required in that top third, you still get to enjoy the rest of the dial with the artisanal finish that you have with that hand engraved finish. It's a brilliant thing. It's worth saying that it's an ultra-thin complication. You get to enjoy that through the sapphire case back. I can see why people find this watch so charming. I certainly do. It's a neo-vintage icon. Rose gold, it works so well. Next up, we've got a A Lange Söhne 1815, 200th anniversary of F.A. Lange. Now, we've sold and talked about lots of 1815s from A Lange Söhne, and I particularly like the 1815 range. I like the use of Arabic numerals. I think it's a more simplistic take on the time-only watch, and as opposed to the Lange 1, which is somewhat quirky. Don't get me wrong, there's a time and a place for a Lange 1, of course there is, but the simplicity and the symmetry that you get from an 1815 works brilliantly. Now, why is this a left field choice? Well, this limited edition of 200 pieces is actually created in a material called honey gold, and it's a proprietary metal that only Lange are able to use, and it's sort of a mix of yellow gold and rose gold and probably a little bit of white gold in there as well. And I don't know the specifics of the blend, but what I can tell you is that it is so unlike, we've got lots of different metals on the table here. It's so unlike the rose gold from Audemars Piguet. It's so unlike the yellow gold that's used in Rolex. It's very different, of course, to the bronze of the Habring. It is its own thing. And Lange use it only for their very, very special limited editions. It's just a lovely thing to see in hand. But it's not a showy watch. It's really toned down and simple. You get to focus on that brilliant dial, but it's a real talking point. I guess it doesn't look lustrous in the same way that rose gold does. And so it feels a little bit more casual. And I really like that because of course it's not. It's much more special than any of those other metal types. And yeah, a real interesting left field watch. Brilliant thing. Moving on. Here's a watch that I almost wish was part of last week's drop because it's a really impressive Calatrava from Patek Philippe. This reference is the 3923A. So that is to say that it is a steel Calatrava. And ironically, I guess from a left field perspective, Patek tend to use steel for very special dress watches. It's a sort of inverse sort of mentality, I suppose. These are extremely rare, and the condition of this one is excellent. It has a closed case back, which I really like. It sort of feels utilitarian. It has a brushed silver dial, which is completely flawless. But you have all of those characteristics of an iconic Calatrava. It's a really simple dress watch, and you could probably wear that to a black tie event and it would fit in brilliantly well. But of course, is a steel watch. It's kind of this sort of juxtaposition that it finds itself in. I love it. It's a small case size, I think 32 millimeters, small Calatrava cross on the manual wind crown. It just punches so much more than its size would lead you to believe. It's a really, really special thing, and I'm so pleased that we have it in. Someone's going to enjoy that. I wish it was me. So that's it for our left field dress watches. I mentioned at the start that we're going to go on to a couple of Rolexes, and wow, these two are really, really impressive. First up, this is a yellow gold 36mm Datejust. I believe it's from the 90s, but my gosh, I don't think it's been worn for a moment in the last 35 years. It is absolutely mint. The bracelet doesn't move. The case is absolutely sharp. The Jubilee bracelet, of course, it's not a presidential bracelet, and I love that. It's so sharp and crisp. I actually like the dial choice. The dial is a rich gold that blends monolithically into the bracelet and the case. So you end up having this sort of aesthetic that you get with the Midas and you get with the Piaget Polo, which are very of the moment watches. But obviously it's an icon in itself. It's the Datejust. And I think the majority of people, even today, if they were going to go and buy a full gold Rolex, would choose the obvious day date. That's the watch, that's the Tony Soprano watch, that's the watch that you go for when you've made it. And I love the fact that someone has decided to say, nope, I want something a little bit different, a little bit more simplistic. And the Datejust in yellow gold does exactly that. I've heard a few people say that the Rolex Date, Oyster Perpetual Date, is a bit of a miss of a watch, because why wouldn't you just get the Datejust, which is the icon? It's the one that everyone thinks of. And I guess here's my case for why the Rolex Oyster Perpetual Date is definitely worthy of your consideration. Here is a dial that at one point was blue, but has aged to the point that it really looks more like what they call a Jurassic dial, a stone dial. It has this rich depth to it where the blue is no longer the primary color in it, but really this grayish gold from the base material of the dial has come through. You have gold indices, gold hands, and a gold coronet, but you also have the turnograph bezel to it, which doesn't rotate, I have to say. That combination of Datejust aesthetic, different dial finish, plus the patination, plus the turnograph-esque bezel, make this much more interesting than your average Datejust. There's one here. It's a bit of a plain Jane, this thing, and there's absolutely every time and a place for a plain Jane Datejust, don't get me wrong. But if you want something that is a little bit more left field, and this is the theme for today, the Date is absolutely impressive. It's so incredible. It's a value proposition. I'm really pleased that it's here, because I think when you compare it with other watches that we've seen in recent weeks at this level, it packs so much more of a punch. It really is up there with some of the really interesting dress watches, I think, in terms of interest level and in terms of finishing. It's a brilliant thing, and I think this watch is the perfect example of where vintage is such an interesting place to park your money. There is only one watch in existence that looks like this, that has had the history and the aging, that's created this really interesting dial. It's lived a life, but I think it will continue to do so and be enjoyed for many, many years to come. And I think that is why you shouldn't listen to Instagrammers, YouTubers that say the Rolex Date or any other watch should be avoided, or you should focus on, or you should look at these. You should buy what you love. And for whatever reason, this watch resonates with me. I hope it finds someone else that it resonates with equally as much, and it will enjoy a life for many years to come. So that's this week's watch drop. Over 70 watches hitting the site, and so many that I didn't get to talk about that I would have loved to. There's a Day Date 1803 in white gold. There's the Royal Oak Nick Faldo in rose gold. There's even an IWC Edison, which is a really interesting watch. I could talk all day about it, but please do hit the website, go check them out, and I'll see you next week.